What is up, YouTube? It's your boy Kendrick Youngblood. I'm back with another video. Now we're going to be doing a review on Billy Collins' Masterclass on reading and writing poetry. But before we do that, make sure to like, subscribe, comment below if you want more videos like this or what other topics you want me to cover, and I'll drop a video on it. Before we get into, his masterclass specifically, I want to talk about his credentials so you know why he's at the very least qualified to teach the course. Billy Collins was the U.S. Poet Laureate from 2001 to 2003. He was the New York State Poet Laureate from 2004 to 2006. If you don't know what a Poet Laureate is, it's someone who's appointed by a community to spearhead poetry as an art form. Now, he wasn't just that for any community, he was that for New York State and even the U.S. in general. So the man's got some clout. He has published poems in The New Yorker, other big journals. He's published a variety of collections as well. Man is highly acclaimed. He's gotten so many awards and honors. So at the very least, he's qualified. I'm actually a big fan, but I'm going to try to stay as objective about this review as possible. And based on this review, you can decide for yourself whether it's for you or not. Billy Collins has set up the masterclass to be divided into 20 video lessons. And here's what that kind of looks like right here. Okay, I can't actually click on the lessons and show you the videos for fear of actually getting this video taken off of YouTube, so I'm not going to make that mistake. But here's kind of what the lesson plan looks like. There are 20 video lessons, as I stated before. In total, the watch time is about 3.5 hours, but each video lesson itself is about 10.5 minutes. Now, the way the lesson is designed, you're not actually supposed to just watch it all at once. You're supposed to watch maybe 1 or 2 videos a day and practice what you've learned from each of those videos. So even though the course in general is only 3.5 hours long, you're supposed to actually use the course throughout a couple weeks or so. There are 2 types of video lessons throughout this course. There are the discussion lessons, and then there are what I call the solo lessons. The discussion lessons, as you can see here, he will actually invite another poet. In this case, as you can see with 13 and 12, it's Marie Howe, who is a contemporary of his, an incredible poet in her own right. And then in some others, you'll see discussions with students of his, and they will share their own poetry, and he, along with that student, will break down that poem, maybe looking for things like word repetition, spacing, enjambment, and they'll pick it apart that way. And you can actually learn from these creative conversations. So in the discussion video lessons, they aren't addressing we as the students very much. They are sometimes, but not as much as in the solo lessons. But you're still learning an awful lot because based on their creative conversations, you can glean a lot of wisdom and insight when it comes to writing. So the discussions, I would argue, are actually the most potent aspect of the course in general. In the solo lessons, he breaks down either his own poems for things like form, subject, or even his writing process, or he'll break down the poems of other famous poets such as William Shakespeare, Emily Dickinson, Robert Frost, Walt Whitman, you name it. One drawback I would say about the course in general is that little to no poems come from writers of color or queer poets. So in the diversity department, I would say it's lacking, but that could simply be due to the fact that when Billy Collins selected the poems to analyze for the course, he was picking poets who impacted him greatly, and those might not have been minority poets. I would say this course could do a lot more if it had diversity from where it was drawing from. But with that being said, that's a minor drawback, but I just thought I would bring it up. This course is really useful for beginner poets. Extremely. Okay. One thing a lot of newbie poets struggle with is facing poetry and not considering it a daunting task. Not going into a poem oh my God, I have to decode it. I have to figure out what the poet's trying to talk about. He demystifies poetry in general. He expresses that it should be an enjoyable process, right? It's another form of entertainment, just like watching a movie or reading a book, Poetry isn't something to pick apart necessarily, but something to enjoy. So he makes poetry seem more like a pleasant endeavor. So I really like that demystification of poetry there. It's also useful for beginner poets because he defines what poetry is. He explains the history of poetry. He goes into finding your own voice. There's actually 2 lessons on that. That's 14 and 15. And that's particularly useful for beginner poets because they don't know where to find their own voice. He goes into other things that are actually useful for expert poets, or more experienced poets, I should say. Even then, I would say this isn't the most useful for people in that category. Now, if you're trying to brush up on your fundamentals, like you're trying to freshen up on things like understanding how form impacts readers, even if you might have learned that ages ago, that could still be useful as well. You know, it's good to practice those fundamental aspects of writing poetry. Now, he does dive into intangibles that are very hard to teach and thus very hard to learn. That's exactly what experienced poets need. These intangibles might include juggling seriousness versus humor, juggling clarity versus mystery, applying nuance and ambiguity to some aspects of your writing. Those intangibles he teaches really well. But if you already have a handle on that, then I would say for experienced poets, this isn't really for you. So that's another critique I would give. Okay, so in addition to the video lessons themselves, there's also a 60-page complete workbook that accompanies the video lessons. Okay, so he actually starts off the workbook by providing a sort of letter to the new students. Okay, and this letter is supposed to be a sort of like words of encouragement. Right here, he explains all his credentials and why he's qualified to teach the course. That's all very useful. As for the aesthetics and the organization of the workbook, I would say it's really nice, really nice. He actually bases it off of his own personal notebook. You can kind of see his doodles and his sketches, his little notes to himself. All of that kind of adds to the aesthetic of the workbook. He also provides inspirational quotes, inspirational quotes from the video lessons themselves. So you have this one saying poetry is really the only history we have of the human heart. He has other deep quotes that can really inspire writers. There's no chronology involved in poetry. You can go anywhere, you can be anywhere, you can fly. So yeah, there's all sorts. But the real key, the meat and potatoes of the workbook is that there's writing and reading exercise that accompany every single video lesson, which means you can apply what you've learned immediately. And that's the reason why I said you're not supposed to finish the course in 3.5 hours, even though that's the total watch time of the course. You're supposed to watch them individually and then practice what you've learned until you perfect it. So in addition to his writing and reading exercises that he provides, there's also a reading list that contains all the poems that he broke down throughout the course. Okay, so that includes things like, Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken, poems from Hart Crane, things from Marie Howe, because again, Marie Howe was part of those creative conversations, and sometimes they broke down her own poems. Emily Dickinson, you have all these poets, and there's not only a reading list so you can reference where it's coming from, there are also the full poems themselves. There's an appendix of poems. You have all of those listed out. You can see them clearly. And I think that's very useful. That's really beneficial. The workbook itself is probably the only area that I don't have any complaints about. It's just solid, it's complete. Yeah, no questions there. Now there's a community tab. The community tab is kind of like a glorified poetry subreddit of sorts, and you get to interact and network with all the other students who are part of this course. And yeah, you get to receive feedback, sort of do workshops, you get to share your own poems, you get to discuss poetry theory, all that. So I would say this is really great. The downside here is that even though it's supposed to be a community based on his class, he actually doesn't engage in the community based on what I can see, at least. So that kind of sucks, but I mean, you win some, you lose some. Yeah, anyway, so as for the cost of the course, it's about $15 a month or $90 for 1 year of subscription. That might sound like a lot, but I'm telling you right now, if you are a beginner poet, it is more than worth every single dime. Okay, now if you're an experienced poet, not so much. Again, if you're trying to freshen up on your fundamentals, yes, this would be very useful for you. But if you already got those fundamentals down and you're not struggling with intangibles like juggling mystery and clarity, or figuring out how to apply humor in a serious poem, if you've already got all that down, then really I would say it's not for you. So it really just depends. Anyway, that's my review. I hope you like it. I'm sorry I couldn't actually show you some of the video lessons themselves. I'm not trying to get this video taken down. That would suck. So yeah, but I hope you enjoyed it. Like, subscribe, comment below if you want more stuff like this. And with that, I'm out. Peace.